Columbus, Ohio, October 8th, 1890, and on the outskirts of the city, in a hand-built home without electricity, running water, or indoor plumbing, a boy named Edward Rickenbacher comes into the world as the third of 8 children to Swiss immigrant parents who speak German and struggle daily to put food on the table. The family's small plot of land, barely 150 feet by 200 feet, sits on what neighbours generously call countryside, but what everyone knows is closer to swamp. And young Eddie, called Ed by his parents, spends his childhood before and after school helping his mother tend the garden where they grow potatoes, cabbages and turnips, caring for the family's chickens and goats, and delivering the excess milk their growing herd produces to neighbours who have a few pennies to spare. What no one watching this poor immigrant child hauling vegetables and milking goats could possibly imagine. What not even his own family could dream as he leads his ragtag gang of boys they call the Horsehead Gang through Columbus streets, is that this farm boy will become America's deadliest fighter pilot in World War I, shooting down 26 enemy aircraft using tactics that violate every principle taught by European aces, tactics born not from military academies or aristocratic breeding, but from the practical wisdom of a poor boy who learned that survival means never attacking unless you have better than a 50-50 chance of winning. The young Rickenbacher's life revolves around work, as he helps his family cultivate their garden and tend to their livestock. His father, William, a stern disciplinarian who operates a small construction company after 1893, instills in Eddie an understanding that nothing comes easy, that every meal requires labour, that every penny must be earned. His mother, Elizabeth, takes in laundry to supplement the family income, teaching her children through example that when circumstances demand it, you do whatever work is necessary without complaint or shame. The family eats what they grow, vegetables that Eddie plants as seeds in spring, and watches develop through summer until they can be harvested in fall, a process that teaches him patience, timing, and the understanding that success requires waiting for exactly the right moment to act. These lessons, learned in a garden on the edge of Columbus, will later translate into aerial combat tactics that European aces, trained in the chivalrous traditions of mounted cavalry charges, cannot comprehend or counter. August 26, 1904, changes everything. When Eddie's father William dies suddenly in a brawl, leaving 14-year-old Eddie as the de facto head of a household with 7 children and a mother who speaks broken English, Eddie makes a decision that will define his character for the rest of his life, lying about his age to circumvent child labour laws and taking a night job at Federal Glass Factory so his family can eat. He quits within weeks to take a day job at Buckeye Steel Casting Company, reasoning that if he's going to sacrifice his education and childhood, he might as well work during daylight hours when he can at least see what he's doing. From there, he cycles through a beer factory, a bowling alley, a cemetery monument yard, and the Pennsylvania Railroad as an apprentice, each job teaching him about machines, about how things work, about the practical application of mechanical principles that no classroom could teach. Eddie views every job only as a way to make money for his family, but his curious mind absorbs knowledge about engines, about leverage, about efficiency, about how to accomplish tasks with minimal wasted effort. He's unhappy, restless, seeking something he cannot name, until around 1905 when he sees his first automobile, a 2-passenger Ford runabout that combines technology and speed in a way that captivates his imagination completely. Eddie begins his automotive career at Evans Garage and takes a mechanical engineering correspondence course from International Correspondence School in Nip 5 to upgrade his skills, demonstrating the self-education that will characterize his entire life. He successfully campaigns to land a job with the Oscar Lear Automobile Company in Columbus, working under Chief Engineer Lee Freyer, and when he's only 16 years old, Freyer takes him to New York as his riding mechanic for the 1906 Vanderbilt Cup race. The race becomes Eddie's classroom, teaching him about speed, about split-second decisions, about reading conditions and adapting tactics on the fly, lessons that prove more valuable than any formal education. Back in Columbus, he follows Freyer to Columbus Buggy Company as chief testing engineer supervising a dozen men despite being only 16, impressing Harvey S. Firestone with his hard work and mechanical acumen. Firestone sends him on special assignments to Atlantic City for troubleshooting, to the 1909 Chicago Automobile Show for demonstrations, to Texas to solve overheating problems in new Freya-designed engines. At 18, Eddie heads up Columbus Buggy's Dallas agency, responsible for everything from engineering to sales, learning business principles and leadership skills that will serve him throughout his life. To promote his company's automobiles, Eddie enters his first race in Iowa, crashes spectacularly but refuses to quit, and that summer he wins most of the dirt track races he enters, earning a reputation and the nickname Fast Eddie. By 1914, he's a top national racing figure, one of America's top 3 racing drivers, earning the contradictory description from one sports writer as the most daring and the most cautious driver in America today. A characterization that perfectly captures his philosophy of taking calculated risks rather than reckless chances. He races for Duesenberg, for Peugeot, for Maxwell, for the Presto Light team, competing in the Indianapolis 500 4 times, never winning, but always learning, always observing, always calculating odds and making decisions based on probability rather than bravado. His racing career teaches him lessons that military academies don't teach, that aristocratic European officers flying over the Western Front cannot comprehend, that discipline and patience matter more than courage, that winning requires knowing when not to fight. When the United States enters World War I in April 1917, Rickenbacker suggests the Air Service invite race car drivers to form a pursuit squadron, arguing that auto racing has natural similarities to flying, demanding quick reflexes, mechanical acumen and guts. But the army dismisses his suggestion as foolish before drafting him anyway. The military establishment, dominated by officers from privileged backgrounds who view warfare through the lens of cavalry charges and gentlemanly duels, cannot imagine that a working-class mechanic might understand aerial combat better than West Point graduates. Because of his racing background, Rickenbacker becomes General John Pershing's driver, then Billy Mitchell's, whom he badgers relentlessly until Mitchell finally agrees to send him to flying training, though at age 27 Rickenbacker is considered too old for such duty. The age restriction reflects military thinking that views flying as requiring youthful reflexes rather than mature judgment, a bias that Rickenbacker will prove catastrophically wrong. Rickenbacker enlists in May 1917, arrives in France on June the 26th as part of the American Expeditionary Forces, and his first assignment as a driver for General Pershing becomes his opportunity when he meets Captain James Miller, tasked with building the infant US Air Service's first training school overseas, who offers him a job as chief engineer. Over the following months, Rickenbacker repairs aircraft and oversees construction, while sitting through the same classes and lectures as the cadets, using his position to take aircraft up on his own for hands-on flight experience, teaching himself through practice and observation rather than formal instruction. In January 18, he finally receives orders to gunnery school and a follow-on assignment to the 94th Aero Squadron, the first American squadron to see combat in World War I, where he comes under the tutelage of French flying ace Major Raoul Lufbery. Regarding his flight training, Rickenbacker later states, "All I learned from Lufbery, acknowledging his debt to the French ace, while developing his own distinct tactical philosophy." Rickenbacker's first combat mission occurs on April 13th, 1918, and it nearly ends in disaster when he and Reed Chambers become lost in fog, prompting Flight Commander David Peterson to call Rickenbacker a bloody fool for flying off in a fog. But 2 weeks later, on April 29th, Rickenbacker shoots down his first enemy plane, a 2-seater Pfalz reconnaissance aircraft, describing the moment in his memoir with clinical precision. At 150 yards, he presses his triggers, watching tracer bullets cut a streak of living fire into the rear of the Pfalz tail, raising his airplane's nose slightly so the fiery streak lifts like water from a garden hose, settling into the pilot's seat, the swerving of the Pfalz indicating its rudder is no longer controlled by a directing foot. At 2,000 feet above enemy lines, He pulls up from his dive and watches the enemy machine curve slightly to the left before crashing into the woods a mile inside German lines. He has brought down his first enemy airplane without being subjected to a single shot, a pattern that will define his entire combat career. The other pilots in the 94th Squadron, mostly Ivy League college graduates from privileged backgrounds, initially reject Rickenbacker as a social inferior, one Yale graduate describing him as a lemon on an orange tree who tends to throw his weight around the wrong way. They view this working-class mechanic, this race car driver without formal education, as unsuitable company for gentlemen, unable to imagine that his background gives him advantages they lack. Rickenbacker proves happier tinkering with engines than socializing, and older than all the others. He is conservative in his flying and has to work to overcome a dislike for aerobatics. While other pilots practice flashy barrel rolls and loops, considering aerial combat a test of individual courage similar to medieval jousting, Rickenbacker approaches it as a mechanical problem requiring practical solutions, analysing angles and velocities and probabilities with the same careful attention he applied to racing automobiles. By May 28, 1918, Rickenbacker claims his fifth victory and becomes an ace, receiving the French Croix de Guerre that month. But then an ear infection turns into an abscess and grounds him for 3.5 months during the Chateau Thierry campaign. His enforced confinement in a hospital bed, frustrating as it is, gives him time to think, to analyse what he's learned in his brief combat experience, to develop principles that will revolutionise his approach to aerial warfare. He realises that European aces, trained in cavalry traditions, view aerial combat as individual duels where courage and skill determine the outcome, where attacking bravely even against superior numbers represents honourable conduct. But Rickenbacker, who grew up poor, who understands that survival matters more than honour, who learned in automobile racing that finishing alive beats dying gloriously, develops a different philosophy entirely. He formulates 3 principles that contradict everything taught by European aces, rules that will horrify traditionalists but prove devastatingly effective. Rickenbacker's new principles of engagement germinate while he's confined in the hospital. Never attack unless there is at least a 50-50 chance of success. Always break off an engagement that seems hopeless, and know the difference between cowardice and common sense. These rules, born from a farm boy's practical wisdom rather than aristocratic notions of chivalry, represent a fundamental reimagining of aerial combat doctrine. European aces teach that courage means attacking regardless of odds, that breaking off combat represents cowardice, that dying in a hopeless fight brings honour. Rickenbacker rejects this entirely, understanding that dead pilots win no victories, that aircraft are expensive resources not to be wasted, that winning the war requires accumulating victories over time rather than seeking glorious deaths. His fellow pilots, raised on stories of knights and cavalry charges, initially view his caution with contempt, unable to see that he's developing tactics that will prove far more lethal than their supposedly brave charges into certain death. Rickenbacker returns from the hospital in time for the St. Mihiel offensive on September 12, 1918, by which time the 94th and other squadrons have converted from their agile but temperamental Nieuport airplanes to the more rugged, higher-powered Spad 13. The Spad proves a perfect fit for Rickenbacker's style of attack, offering speed and firepower that allow him to implement his tactical philosophy with deadly efficiency. He makes another kill on September the 14th against a Fokker D7, and another the day after that. And although Rickenbacker's performance is rising, the 94th Squadron remains disappointing after a sluggish summer at Chateau Thierry. Major Harold Hartney, wanting new leadership to restore the Hat in the Ring gang to its former greatness, chooses Lieutenant Rickenbacker over several captains as the new commander of the 94th Squadron, a controversial decision that gives Rickenbacker the authority to implement his unconventional tactics squadron-wide. Rickenbacker inculcates his squadron with his principles of engagement, and he is determined to blind the eyes of the enemy by taking out their observation balloons, giant gas bags that appear easy targets but are heavily guarded and dangerous to attack. Rickenbacker leads planning sessions for multi-squadron raids of as many as 14 planes, with one reporter likening him to a football coach, boning up for the season ahead, with conferences on methods, blackboard talks, and ideas for air battle tactics. His approach shocks pilots trained to view aerial combat as individual heroics, treating it instead as organised team operations requiring coordination and planning. He teaches his men to hunt in packs, to use altitude and sun for concealment, to set up ambushes rather than charging headlong into fights, to calculate odds before engaging and withdraw immediately if conditions prove unfavourable. European aces mock this supposedly cowardly approach, but Rickenbacker's squadron begins accumulating victories at rates that silence critics. His notable attack upon no fewer than 7 German aircraft on September 25, 1918, during which he shoots down 2, subsequently gains him the US Medal of Honor in 1930. The engagement perfectly demonstrates Rickenbacker's tactical philosophy in action. While on a voluntary patrol over the lines near Billy, France, First Lieutenant Rickenbacker attacks 7 enemy planes, 5 Type Fokker protecting 2 Type Halberstadt, and disregarding the odds against him, he dives on them and shoots down one of the Fokkers out of control before attacking one of the Halberstadts and sending it down also. But the official citation, written by officers who don't understand his tactics, describes him as disregarding the odds against him, when in reality Rickenbacker has carefully calculated those odds before attacking, determined that his altitude advantage and position relative to the sun give him sufficient edge, and planned his escape route should the engagement turn unfavourable. He doesn't disregard odds, he reads them like a race car driver reads track conditions, making split-second calculations that appear instinctive but reflect years of training his mind to assess tactical situations. Rickenbacker's technique involves approaching his intended victims carefully, closer than others dare, before firing his guns, a tactic that maximizes accuracy while minimizing ammunition waste. While other pilots open fire at 300 or 400 yards, spraying bullets wildly and hoping for lucky hits, Rickenbacker waits until 150 yards or less, close enough to see individual details on enemy aircraft, close enough that his tracers cannot miss. This requires extraordinary nerve, flying straight at enemy guns while holding fire, resisting every instinct to shoot early, waiting for the perfect moment when missing becomes impossible. His racing background proves invaluable here, teaching him to judge closing speeds and distances with precision, to trust his calculations even when instinct screams to act immediately. He personally checks his aircraft, engine, guns, and even individual bullets before and after each flight, understanding that mechanical reliability matters as much as pilot skill, that a jammed gun or fouled spark plug can mean death regardless of tactical brilliance. The last half of September 1918 becomes Rickenbacker's busiest time in the air, as he implements his tactical principles with devastating effect. On September 14th and 15th he shoots down 2 of Germany's newest airplanes, a pair of imposing Fokker D7, all on his own, and by the end of September he earns promotion to captain and is made commanding officer of the squadron. His leadership transforms the 94th from an underperforming unit into the highest-scoring American squadron in France, not through inspirational speeches about courage and honour, but through systematic application of practical tactics that treat aerial combat as a business of killing efficiently rather than dying gloriously. He continues to fly aggressively but with calculated caution, spending more hours in the air than any other pilot in the service, a total of 300 combat hours, demonstrating that his cautious approach doesn't mean avoiding combat, but rather engaging intelligently. In the final 6 weeks of the war, Rickenbacker brings down 15 aircraft, demonstrating the effectiveness of his tactical approach as he systematically hunts German aircraft with the patience of a farmer waiting for crops to ripen. His 25th and 26th confirmed kills, the last he ever achieves, come on October 30th, 1918, when he notices German aircraft approaching while he patrols over Grand Prix at twice their altitude, and like lambs to the slaughter they come unsuspectingly on, allowing him to let them pass before dipping over, swinging around as he falls, and opening his engine to dive with all speed on the tail of the nearest Fokker. The engagement epitomizes everything Rickenbacker has learned about aerial combat, about patience, about positioning, about waiting for enemies to place themselves in disadvantageous situations rather than forcing engagements on unfavourable terms. When the armistice is finally signed on November 11th, 1918, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker has accumulated 26 confirmed kills on enemy aircraft, making him America's ace of aces, the deadliest American fighter pilot of World War I. He has flown a total of 300 combat hours, more than any other American pilot, and survived 24 aerial encounters with the enemy. His record stands not because he's the bravest pilot, or the most skilled flyer, or the best marksman, but because he understands something European aces trained in cavalry traditions cannot comprehend. That aerial combat is not a chivalrous duel between knights, but a practical problem requiring calculated solutions, that survival matters more than glory, that winning means knowing when not to fight. The farm boy who grew up milking goats and hauling vegetables, who learned patience watching seeds become crops, who understood that success requires waiting for exactly the right moment, has applied those lessons to warfare with devastating effectiveness. The French, the British, and the Germans work hard to improve their airplanes, weapons, and aerial tactics, but American pilots are assigned to squadrons, provided cast-off machines and materials, and expected to survive on their intrepid spirit alone. Rickenbacker always claims he is happy to see a parachute unfurl beneath one of his victims, explaining that his war is against machines, not men, a perspective that reflects his mechanical background rather than martial traditions. This attitude shocks European officers who view warfare as personal combat between warriors, who take pride in killing enemies, who see combat as tests of individual courage. Rickenbacker, who grew up poor and understands that war is organised killing rather than honourable duelling, approaches it as a job to be done efficiently, destroying enemy aircraft to gain air superiority, viewing German pilots not as personal enemies but as obstacles to be removed. His lack of hatred, his mechanical approach to killing, his refusal to glorify combat, all stem from his working-class background that views war as tragic necessity rather than glorious adventure. When Rickenbacker returns home, he is wined and dined from coast to coast, but unlike some who glory in their brief fame, he has no illusions about the durability of being a national hero, saying, "I knew it would be easy to go from hero to zero." He turns down several endorsement offers and an opportunity to star in a feature film for $100,000 because he doesn't want to cheapen his image, signing instead a book deal for $25,000 to publish his memoir, Fighting the Flying Circus. He promotes Liberty Bonds on a speaking tour while still in the army, receives promotion to major, and is released from service in November 1919, though he feels the rank of captain is the only one he truly earned and deserves, preferring to be called Captain Eddie for the rest of his life. His wartime experiences taught him lessons about leadership, about tactics, about making calculated decisions under pressure, lessons that will serve him in the business world where he builds successful companies, where he operates the Indianapolis Speedway, where he transforms Eastern Airlines into one of America's most profitable carriers. The story of Eddie Rickenbacker represents more than just one man's journey from poverty to fame, more than an account of aerial victories and tactical innovations. It demonstrates how background shapes thinking, how the practical wisdom learned tending gardens and milking goats can prove more valuable in combat than aristocratic training in chivalry, how understanding when not to fight matters more than knowing how to fight. European aces, raised on stories of knights and cavalry charges, view aerial combat through the lens of honour and courage, attacking bravely even against impossible odds, dying gloriously in hopeless fights. Rickenbacker, raised in poverty by immigrant parents who taught him that survival requires calculation rather than bravado, approaches combat as a practical problem requiring efficient solutions, understanding that dead pilots win no victories regardless of how courageously they die. His 3 principles of engagement: never attack unless there's at least a 50-50 chance of success, always break off engagements that seem hopeless, and know the difference between cowardice and common sense, represent a revolutionary reimagining of aerial combat doctrine born not from military academies but from a farm boy's understanding that success requires patience and timing. These principles, which horrify traditionalists as supposedly cowardly, prove devastatingly effective because they accumulate victories over time rather than seeking glorious deaths. Rickenbacker survives the war with 26 kills not because he avoids combat but because he engages intelligently, calculating odds before, attacking, maintaining situational awareness that allows him to withdraw from unfavourable situations, understanding that living to fight another day beats dying heroically in a single engagement. The farm boy who learned patience watching vegetables grow from seeds, who understood that harvesting requires waiting for exactly the right moment, who developed mechanical understanding through necessity rather than formal education, applied those lessons to aerial warfare with results that astounded military professionals. His success demonstrates that warfare, stripped of romantic notions about honour and glory, is ultimately a practical endeavour where victory goes to those who make better decisions under pressure, who calculate odds accurately, who understand that courage without intelligence leads to graveyards rather than victory celebrations. Eddie Rickenbacker proved that a poor immigrant child given opportunity and determination could revolutionize military doctrine, could outperform aristocrats trained from birth for warfare, could teach professional officers that wisdom sometimes comes from unexpected sources. When Rickenbacker dies on July 23, 1973, at age 82 in Zurich, Switzerland, he leaves behind a legacy that extends far beyond his 26 aerial victories in World War I. His tactical principles, born from a farm boy's practical wisdom, influenced American military doctrine throughout the 20th century, teaching generations of fighter pilots that knowing when not to fight matters as much as knowing how to fight, that accumulating victories over time beats seeking glorious deaths, that survival requires calculation rather than bravado. The garden outside that small house in Columbus, where young Eddie learned patience and timing, while growing potatoes and cabbages, produced lessons more valuable than any military academy could teach, proving that wisdom comes from unexpected places, and that sometimes the best training for aerial combat is learning to wait for vegetables to ripen.